All right, folks, this is Scott with the Game Audio Institute, and as promised, we are starting our journey into music analysis of games, right? We're going to be taking a look at very specific kinds of games out there, popular games, and analyzing the music systems inside them because that is yet another skill that you need to have besides just being able to compose and put things in implementation, whatever like that, and middleware. You need to know kind of how the game is actually triggered, and what better way to do that than to actually study how the very popular games actually did these kinds of things. So we're going to start right away with a game from Bethesda called Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, an extremely popular game. It came out in 2011 and it is continuing to be very popular. They keep releasing new revamped versions of it, so this is a fairly relevant situation even today. So let's take a look at that right now. So for those of you who are unaware, the Elder Scrolls Skyrim is the fifth installment of the Elder Scrolls series by Bethesda. It takes place in a very large open world. It's a single-player RPG adventure game in a fantasy setting, and the world that it takes place in is in the region, or the province, of Skyrim. And it's a northern region of the world of Tamriel, which is the world that all the Elder Scrolls games take place in. So the composer for all of this music pretty much is Jeremy Soule. He wrote all of the music, and there is a lot of it. There's basically 53 separate tracks of music in the original release, but unlike films, some tracks can be shorter and others more full length. But what we're interested in is how they're being treated. So the thing about it is that, when we want to analyze music, we want to know how long the player is actually in the game. Skyrim is generally designed to be played for literally dozens of hours, and I myself can attest to this, having played it till, daybreak, basically, a few times. It's an open world fantasy RPG, but it has certain locations that get their own textures or themes, and there are a few cutscenes as well, although the way they handle them is a little bit different. So it's best to think of each of these kinds of categories as states, essentially, right? Or to use an analogy that you're more familiar from music production, maybe more like individual channels on an audio mixer or in a digital audio workstation. So keep in mind this is how just this particular game works only, right? So remember the watchword that we've always talked about in games, which is it depends. If we talk about another game, it'll probably have a totally different system. The thing is that even though we have lots of these sort of channels that are available, we can really only hear one of these at a time, essentially. And the question is, how do you switch between the channels? You can't really use time. You change on events, you change on actions, basically. So you're basically using a similar method that you might have been using if you're familiar with old automation, the snapshot, where basically you have a way to record the position of all those channels, and it's saved as a state which is not dependent on time. So whenever an action happens, it's going to actually change that particular channel, and the rest of the channels will be muted, or you won't hear them as often. So here's how the channels kind of break down in Skyrim. Our first one that we're going to look at is called the Open World channel. That's the music that you're going to hear if you're outside and exploring above ground. And, in most cases, if your character's out in the open world, or even walking in town or villages or pathways or going inside several shops, music will play a track to completion without any interruption at all, usually. There may be some differences in the open world that's outside of the town versus the open world that's inside of the town. This is more for like the really big towns. For smaller towns, probably not so much of that going on. And of course, at the same time you're hearing all of these pieces of music, you're also hearing a lot of just automatic ambiances and things like that. We're not actually concerned with that right now. But the interesting thing is that this open world channel often will have several seconds, even up to a minute worth of pausing before the next track of music will start. But again, with all of these other things going on, you don't notice it as much when you have all these other outside sounds happening, people talking in the villages, various ambiances and stuff like that. The next channel to talk about that's commonly experienced in the game is the underground channel. So the underground channel is basically whenever you spend a bunch of time fighting in underground tombs, temples, and dwellings of monsters and maybe other enemies, That's very typical for the type of genre that we're looking at, this sort of fantasy-based RPG. So this is a similar playlist to number one, but the focus here is generally on more looping kinds of things, moody or eerie atmospheres, suitable for exploring underground, and it usually won't involve a lot of different pieces, maybe 3 or so, because usually what happens is you're going to encounter an enemy fairly quickly. And that brings us to number 3, which is the combat channel. The combat channel is basically giving you combat music that is triggered whenever an enemy has detected you, and any other channel above or beyond ground will be faded when this happens. So you can actually be getting into battle either before, or either above ground, or below ground. But the idea ends up being is that once the game has decided you are in combat, and that may sometimes take a while. So usually it's not meant to go into combat when you're fighting wolves and things like that on the road. But if you start encountering like a fort of bandits and stuff like that, some kind of stronghold of bandits, eventually pretty soon it'll kick into the battle music, as well as, of course, anywhere underground. Now, the interesting thing about the combat channel is that there is absolutely no detection of intensity whatsoever. It doesn't keep track of things like, for example, your health or any of that sort of stuff. It just plays constantly through. And in fact, actually, once you defeat the enemy, it then crossfades back into whatever channel was playing at the time, which was either be the open world channel if you're above ground, or the underground channel if you are in a cave or something like that. Now, the last one to talk about are indoor locations. So when you're in a town, certain indoor locations can actually have this sort of result as well, where basically the channel only becomes active when the player has entered a specific indoor location, and the choice of location is going to determine what piece of music is selected. So this has a few subcategories, but the basic ones are going to fall into things like, for example, inns for travelers. Okay, so almost every town of any size really has some kind of inn usually that you can stay at, and hang out and stuff like that. And interestingly enough, what ends up happening frequently is that there is diegetic music happening when you walk into these establishments. So you'll find like a bard singing a song. This is actually diegetic music, though it's actually taking place physically inside the space, which actually means it's not running on the music channel, which means that when we're listening to it like here right now, we're not going to actually hear any audio when we walk into these kinds of places. Our music will basically fade out to nothing effectively. But in every town where there's an inn, there's usually somebody playing, or maybe there might be some different kind of music. But for sure, that music, above the open world channel music, will fade out or change in some way if you're inside an inn. The next one to talk about is the Ruler's Palace, or a Longhouse, sometimes they're called. Most regions in Skyrim have a town and a building where the ruler resides. They're often called Jarls. But the idea is that when you walk into that, there will usually be a change in music. As far as I've been able to determine, there's not a specific piece of music that is for those particular indoor locations, but it does play from a small playlist of that type of indoor location. So in other words, you might hear the same piece of music playing in different specific, like if you go into a palace in one town, you go into a palace in another town. At some point, if you do it enough times, you'll probably hear the same piece of music playing. But one thing's for sure, that above ground, that open world music will fade out, and the other piece of music will start playing at that point when you get into those things. There is the player skill tree, which is not really terribly musical per se. It really tends to have more like stingers and things like that, or more effects kinds of sounds. But it has a slightly musical quality, but it really isn't music at all. One thing's for sure, when you go into the player skill tree, you can actually change around things and stuff like that, and it's not really playing music. And so it'll definitely fade out the music when you go to this particular category and you're looking at these skills and changing your skill levels and stuff like that. The last one to talk about is cutscenes. There are actually surprisingly very few real full cutscenes in Skyrim, actually. It's an interesting thing. Most of the time, it sets a cutscene up by just simply you walking into the thing, and dialogue starts to happen, and you can move around and walk around in the whole place, and if you want, not listen to anybody in the cutscene if you feel like it. So it's quite different than a typical cutscene, which plays a lot like a movie. Basically, what'll happen will be the characters will talk. You'll still have the same background music that you're currently having. It doesn't change or anything like that. And you can pretty much, it feels like normal gameplay, but there's just somebody talking and saying some stuff to you that's important. And then maybe you have to respond or something like that. So that's kind of how they handle that. All right, folks. So that's all of it for this time, and we're going to keep looking at music systems in games. Hey, if you have a game that you'd like to see the music system analyzed for us, let us know in the comments. Let us know what you might be interested in doing if you've like been watching kinds of games and you'd like, hey, how do they do that kind of thing? So we'd be happy to help you out if you want to do that. Anyway, you can like, you can share, you can subscribe, tell us your friends, everything like that. And if you feel like donating some money to us, you can also donate to our Patreon, and that'll give you a lot of goodies and stuff like that as well. So at any point, we will see you at the next time, and I hope this helps you get your game audio on.